My name is Ann Kelly. I'm Vice President of Government Relations at Ceres. We are a nonprofit mobilizing some of the highest level financial leaders, investors, and companies to fight for a more sustainable world, and in particular, to work on climate and energy policy, given the threat of climate change. We're based in Boston. We have about 175 employees, also have a California office. And in the last 2 years, our staff is spread throughout the country. I'm really looking forward to talking to all of you, in particular to hearing your questions on this crucial, vital issue of climate change, about which we know quite a bit. And of course, we're facing just dire consequences and a deadline. So happy to meet you, Mafalda. That's what I will do, and I'm looking forward again to questions and very happy to be interrupted. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the organization and what we do, and I have some colleagues who have joined me who will be placing some references in the chat, which could be helpful for you. But basically, let's go back to 1989 at the Exxon Valdez spill. Many of you probably were not born then, but you've no doubt heard about the spill and its implications that really called upon the public and called upon, in particular, a group of investors and environmentalists to call for higher standards of accountability in the corporate community. Fast forward, that has manifested itself in an investor network on climate risk that Ceres has mobilized with several $1 trillion of assets under management. We don't own any of those assets, let me underscore that, but we do work with those investors to help them be more active in the companies they own, to raise the bar on corporate performance. So we work with religious investors, with pension funds, with institutional investors at all levels, and we have it's become a major network from what was originally a few socially responsible investors. We also have a company network that has about 50 companies in it, major Fortune 500s, all of whom are looking to improve their sustainability profile. Our job is to raise the bar on their performance continually. We offer tough love. It's more of a health club than a resort, really pushing companies in particular to improve their sustainability profile, but as I said earlier, primarily to reduce emissions, to address climate change, and to do so in a way that is rapid and responsible, and in particular puts equity at the center, and I can talk more about that. The third group I want to mention is the group that I supervise, which is our policy team. And there we have over 80 companies who we mobilize and we bring to Capitol Hill and to 17 states to talk to lawmakers about climate change, about the need specifically for rules and regulations to reduce emissions, to make sure that the US is a global leader on climate change. And let me just be honest with you, we have a long way to go in that regard, but we've made progress, and I'm happy to talk about that. We've been working with companies and investors for about 10 years now, taking them to Capitol Hill, talking with lawmakers about the need for increased uptake of renewable energy. And at this point, the threshold question is that we need a major federal investment in the clean energy economy. Just as we years ago invested in the interstate highway system and in the railroad system, the US needs to mobilize and invest in our clean energy entrepreneurs so that we can increase renewable energy technologies, so that we can scale renewable energy and technologies, so we can really bring emissions down and meet our interim goal, our 2030 goal, and our long-term goal for emissions reduction. Again, very happy to answer questions about that, but I wanted to underscore that at this very moment, we're at a point where Congress can and should act on making that investment that President Biden has called for a reality. And we have the chance to do that. So I want to say a once in a lifetime opportunity, but this is a crucial moment that will go away. Let me just stop right there and see if anyone on the line wants to interrupt me with a question. And I'm going to keep my eye on the chat as well, because I know you all are popping questions there. I might invite one of my colleagues to put a description of Ceres in the chat, and in particular of our website, so folks can read a little bit more about what I just was referencing. Some of you may be wondering, well, are you why are you working with all of these wealthy investors and companies? Why are you doing this work for them? And it's a good question. And the reason is that it often takes a nonprofit leadership to mobilize and organize these financial leaders so that they can act collectively for the greater good. And that was really the vision of the group that established Ceres way back in '89. We use both peer pressure, peer learning, the benefit of collective action by really mobilizing them and allowing them their own voice. So on the policy front, this helps enormously to form a big tent. And when we are talking to lawmakers about how to come forward with economically sound solutions. Now, we've all known for years that the business community has strong lobbying power. What we're doing is making sure that they are mobilized in the right direction. And in this case, to get very specific, the Build Back Better bill, which we got behind the last several months, was of crucial importance. Now, it is of crucial importance, but the name has likely changed. It would call for a record amount of investment, $500 billion, in the clean energy economy to promote wind and solar and to help us really wean off of fossil fuel resources over time. It's crucially important. I don't have to tell this audience about how important this has become in the last few tragic weeks as we have watched the situation in Ukraine made more difficult by the dependence of Europe on Russian oil and gas. So I won't go in that that's not our direct topic, but needless to say, there is tremendous potential in terms of energy security if we can develop our wind and our solar resources and the technologies that will enable us to eventually get off of fossil fuels. So we have a few letters we've put out lately. We have statements and ads, and this is all part of our combined campaign that we're pursuing in Washington, D.C. At the same time, and if you've heard from Secretary Pete Buttigieg, you know that we absolutely have to electrify transportation. Transportation emissions are the greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And the good news is that the bill that was passed in the fall, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, will allow for a tremendous increase in EV infrastructure so that we can have charging infrastructures throughout the country. And again, hasten the scaling of electric vehicles, hasten the transition to electric vehicles, which we so very much need to do. So those are two really crucial areas in very short order that we're attempting to do in Washington, D.C. And there's many, many ways to help that happen. But Ceres is really looking to expedite that process, and that's one of our core missions. Now, as I said this, I'm just moving over to the chat to see if I am seeing any questions that have come up, because I want to be responsive to direct questions. And I'm just scrolling through here to see if there are any. Thank you to my colleagues who put a little bit of background on Ceres into the chat. And what Wes has also put in is our Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance. Well, what is that? Well, that's a good example of how the power of collective action can move an industry forward. This is a group of companies who own their own fleets, and they're looking to expedite the electrification of those fleets. So these are major, what we call medium and heavy duty trucks, so major trucks. And they've come together to try to shift the marketplace, right? Because we've got to have smart economics in order to make this work. But they've also done that so that they can shift the policymakers. So they work together. And if there's anyone listening who would like to be a part of that alliance, if you own your own fleet, obviously it attracts a particular size of company, but we would welcome participation. So it's just one example of how we're mobilizing companies to collectively create the change that we need to see. And again, blending those market forces along, of course, with political will.
Mhm.
Okay, I think I see a question coming in. Go ahead. I thought I heard someone's voice there.
Yes. hear me now?
Yes, now I hear you.
Sorry, I had complications with.
Your voice is actually going in and out a little bit, but I do want to note that the question asked, my
I
colleague
thought
Barbara.
that you sound very well through.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not really hearing your voice come through. But I just want to underscore the note in the chat, which is that 84% of Ceres operating expenditures directly support the program delivery. So that was the question on our administrative expenses. Think of ourselves as pretty lean and mean, and we always have been. A tremendous amount of our work and our funding, it goes directly to the programs themselves. I'm going to pause for a second because I think you're still trying to get in, and I very much want to hear your voice.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, yes,
Yay.
perfect.
I just wanted to say I did choose Ceres because of their well thought through, multifaceted approach to climate change. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on not just the initiatives and partnerships, but also the focus sectors that you have.
Absolutely. We work specifically with some of the hardest to abate sectors. So these are some of the sectors that have the greatest number of emissions. And I can start with oil and gas. We could talk about energy or steel or manufacturing, and just understand that these are companies that are entrenched in some cases, embedded in models that grew out of our fossil fuel economy. And so what's the challenge? Well, the challenge is to specifically get them to quickly transition their energy resources and get them to quickly bring their emissions down. So one of the ways they do that is to set targets. And there's a program called a science-based target initiative. Well, what's that? Well, it's based on the climate science. There's an organization that can define for a given company in a given sector what their emissions reduction needs to be. So companies have publicly set those targets. That really helps because then their customers see that, their employees see that number, but importantly, their investors who deeply understand that climate risk is financial risk, and that's something Ceres has been saying for over 30 years. Climate risk is financial risk. Climate risk will lead to business disruption. Climate risk will lead to destruction of the economy, in addition to destruction of communities throughout the world. The investors who understand that climate risk is a financial risk can then put pressure on those companies. And investor pressure is real pressure, I'm sure all of you know, to make certain that they quickly and in an organized way, and ideally they can profitably transition their organizations to reduce their emissions. So that's really the challenge of the moment. And I don't want to suggest this is easy. It isn't easy at all, making these kinds of transitions. And what's the hardest thing about it? The hardest thing about it is that we have no more time. We have 8 years,
Exactly.
but we really don't have that time, right? Because the dangers from climate change are already with us.
Yes, I live in Australia, and
Oh,
the effects of climate change are very much felt and worsening from year to year. In the last 5 years, I lived through
I'm sorry to hear that.
million
Your
hectares
voice,
for a scale that's.
I apologize. Your voice has cut out. Your mic has cut out again. But what I heard you say is that you're calling in from Australia. We know about the extreme heat waves in Australia, but I'd love to hear more about what you had to say.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
And that in the past 5 years, we had the worst drought. Fires that have decimated hectares for a scale that's the size of England. And they have killed over 1 billion animals. currently
Wow.
going through the second wave of the worst floods in living memory. So climate change is very much here. And part of the reason why I chose Ceres is because we are focusing on policy and without big companies.
I heard you. You're absolutely right. The damages of climate change are absolutely with us, and you just gave a terrific recitation about the wildfires and the heat and the loss of animals, and then I lost you after that.
I was just saying that we lost over 1 billion animals, and at the moment we're going through a second. Uh, we need to move on quickly, and that cannot be done without status quo and without a change of the big companies.
Correct. Absolutely right. Yes, you've just articulated our theory of change. This isn't going to happen if we don't bring on our major financial players. So absolutely well said. That's exactly our theory of change. We have got to scale this, and we've got to do it quickly. We have got to bring on Wall Street, and we have got to bring on our major corporate players, each and every one. Ceres is part of a program called Climate Action 100 Plus. And that is a project with several other investor groups where we look at over 100 of the major emitters around the world. We put collective pressure on those companies, not just from one or two investors. I think there's a total of about 350 global investors who can, and again, we're talking about multinationals here, so who can put specific pressure on those companies to come up with their transition plans, again, to profitably transition, but to do it in an expedited way and without delay. And so that's a huge part of our effort to move companies, and we've had real success, and we're going to continue that effort. But of course, that is, as you can imagine, labor and time intensive. And thank you. My colleague has just put in a link to Climate Action 100 Plus, and you can take a closer look at that so you can understand the scale of the effort.
Could you tell us, in your opinion, what has been Ceres' most impactful project or strategy?
I think the most impactful strategy goes right back to our roots, was the idea that the pressure of investors can really have an impact. I'm a lawyer. I've brought lawsuits. I understand environmental regulation, which is crucial, but the pressure of investors is uniquely effective on corporate behavior. And that, again, goes right back to our beginnings. And so that's a place where bringing shareholder resolutions, having investors engage in dialogue, having investors publicly expose companies both to punish and to reward in appropriate circumstances, I think has really been Ceres, the most important part of our legacy. And that's at the core of what Climate Action 100 Plus is all about. Because obviously the opposite, you don't want to have investors continuing to endorse behavior that is going to set us backwards. Investors have to be forward thinking, and they, again, understand that climate risk is financial risk, and that they are going to suffer financial risk if we don't control climate change. It's the biggest market failure of all time. And so their voice, their well-informed, economically sound voice, is perhaps the most important that we can cultivate. I say perhaps the most important because it's also important to listen to employees and to other stakeholders, to communities, cities, states, and of course, I'm going to say lawmakers, because I think our second strategy, dare I say, is to work with lawmakers and to make sure that lawmakers understand what investors are saying.
Yes, because it's only by changing the laws that you change the status quo, and other countries will follow. So you can set one of the major polluters into becoming one of the major players to fight against climate change.
Exactly. Exactly right. Got to change the laws, and we need to do that. The US needs to be a leader here, and then other countries should follow suit.
Mm. And in
The
terms
US is
of
Go ahead.
No, please go.
No, I didn't want to shy away from the fact that the US has been the major emitter. So I'm in no way suggesting that this is not first and foremost a responsibility of the United States. That's all I wanted to underscore. Go ahead.
I was just wondering because, part of the initiatives that you see worldwide have, I wouldn't say that is a short-sightedness, but it's a focus, and they focus on sustainability or regenerative agriculture, or, like focusing on one of the sections, like protecting global resources and water, which is all valid. um, I think that, however, the most impactful way to go throughout the spectrum has to be policy. And unfortunately, until now, there haven't been a lot of consequences to either companies or governments that haven't fulfilled their promises. So it's part of the thing that really appealed to me with Ceres, is that you do give that tough love, and you put your money where your mouth is, and you make things happen. So, and you focused probably on the hardest sectors that have, you know the biggest footprint and the biggest impact to make.
That's right, and that is why I use the word tough love. We are absolutely comfortable making people uncomfortable and being confrontational. That's vital. I love the bicep in the chat. That's the name of our policy coalition is Businesses for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, which is abbreviated as BICEP. You mentioned also, though, I want to just underscore, you mentioned water. Of course, water is also a vital risk. We're very clear on the water climate nexus. And so investors have also come to fully embrace water and as a water risk, and water management as being of crucial importance. And you also mentioned sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And I want to say we have a whole working group of companies that we are pushing on regenerative agriculture. You may know in the
Mm-hmm.
US, we have a major bill that comes up every few years. It's a farm bill, a major piece of legislation. This year, we are trying to make that farm bill a climate bill, in particular, to focus on the benefits of regenerative agriculture. Yes, going to take a lot of work. And yes, there's a lot of confrontation involved, but I didn't want to suggest that we aren't also looking at the importance of water, of agriculture, and also, frankly, forests. And
Mm-hmm.
thank you. Yeah, my colleague just put our water program in the chat as well.
Yeah, I think that it's no longer about building just sustainable systems. Is about building anti-fragility systems that are not just coping and dealing with the impacts of climate change and trying to diminish them and trying to taper them, but also preparing us and changing our society as a whole to something new, to something that is, largely still um, wishful of technologies that will help. But I think that with uh, programs like Ceres has, the change can be done now. The steps can be done now, and they are very clear. And I think that that's what really attracted me to your organization. It's pragmatic. It's, no frills. It's you can still be hopeful, but very precise on what to do next.
Exactly. Very precise. And the good news here is that we actually know what to do in many areas. We really do know the transition that needs to happen and the opportunities. We haven't even talked about the opportunity side.
Mm-hmm.
The opportunities are just immense. The new technologies, the job potential, the possibility of restoring the ocean by getting the plastic out of it, the possibility of restoring ecosystems and making sure that we don't have another round of 1 billion animals dying in Australia. I mean, there really is, the word regenerative is appropriate. The word resilience is appropriate. There are tremendous things we can do to protect the natural resources that we have left, and really to build a cleaner, more resilient future for our children and grandchildren. So, I mean, there is hope in this equation. We just really need to bank on that renewable resource called political will to get something done. We absolutely know what to do.
What would you recommend for the average person to get involved with, or what steps would you guide them to follow to, have a role in climate change?
I love that question, and I wish you and I had a couple more hours together tonight, but let me be brief. Um, I'd be remiss if I didn't suggest going to Ceres.org, which is already in the chat. And there's a full menu. You're just getting a little sampling here in the chat, but there's a full menu of ways to participate, and I would really invite folks to do that, especially if you're interested in the economic equation, which is where Ceres is really a specialist. And there's any number of wonderful organizations out there that do terrific work on climate. You can Google away, but let me get more specific. We have many NGO partners that are highlighted on our site as well. If you're in the US, you should call your senator. Call them every week. There's an 800 number. You can Google their number, and you simply say who you are. You are a constituent. I want you to do something about climate change. I want you to act on climate change. That's all you have to say. And that's true if your senator is a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat. Call them, tell them repeatedly. And that's all you have to say. You can tell the person that answers the phone, because they're keeping a log of who's saying yes, act, and who's saying slow this down. You can do the same with your congressperson. So everybody in the US has obviously their own congressperson and their own senator. Easy to find out who it is. The number's on the website. Make a call. It is 60 seconds, and you keep weighing in. They don't get calls. You're more comfortable with an email? Send an email. I really am concerned about future generations. I want you to act on climate, and do it now. Mention anything you want: animals, children, communities, forests, water. Pick your own angle. But if they don't see a cascade of messages, then they will believe, and unfortunately many of them do believe, that the public doesn't care. If you're in another jurisdiction, if you're in another country, generally the same process ensues. You can call your member of parliament. You can call the lawmaker who is responsible for representing your interests, and let them know that you really care about this and you want to do something. I also really support action at the local level, your own city or town or community, where you could mobilize folks to do campaigns like getting new EV infrastructure in your town, like having people work together on energy efficiency projects, on reducing, trying to have building decarbonization, on seeing if your town or community can have access to renewable energy, no matter where you are. And that will be a really interesting journey. And by doing that, you can understand what the steps are. Unfortunately, one of those difficult steps is often siting. Believe it or not, there are communities that don't want the siting of wind turbines. See if there's one in your community or your state, and you can show up and say yes, yes, and yes. There's nothing more beautiful than wind turbines on a landscape, or close to shore or offshore. If you've ever had to live near a real power plant, a coal-fired power plant, you can see that windmills are nowhere near as obtrusive or as obviously as polluting or as dangerous. Those are just a few suggestions, and obviously the average person has to looking at their own carbon footprint, trying to drive an electric vehicle, trying not to fly as often. There are many guides online for looking at your own, but what I really think we need, and what Ceres is about, is systems change. It's largely about what are the systems that we can influence. And I really invite folks to get active, and as you noted, to work on changing our rules and regulations, because if we don't change the law on this front, it's going to be very difficult to make the kind of rapid change that we need to have. I love that someone put in the chat an exciting development last week, which was that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, put out a rule to call for mandatory climate risk disclosure, something Ceres has been working on for decades. The Biden administration understands that climate risk is financial risk, and committed to embedding the notion of climate risk into our financial system. So, keeping his promise, the SEC came out and put out rules to say, well, let's make sure that companies put forward their record on climate risk. What are they doing with their emissions, both their immediate emissions, their indirect emissions, the emissions in their supply chains. Why is that important? Because when investors are making investment decisions, they need comparable, decision useful, uniform information for company X, Y, and Z. Without that information, worth the risk that capital is allocated in an inappropriate way that is not taking account of real climate risk. So this is a breakthrough moment. This is one to celebrate. These rules will be effective in about 60 days, and it's a huge accomplishment. I'm looking to see if there are other questions. I'm very happy to answer if other people have questions at this point. I just want to underscore, and this isn't hyperbole, there is profound urgency around climate change, and really everyone needs to be a part of the solution. What we really need to do, Mafalda, yes, I do not hear you. Let me be quiet so I can see if I can hear if you're speaking. Okay, I'm not hearing you now. If someone else can hear Mafalda, please let me know. Again, I really do invite you to tool around on our website. It's chock full of information, and would certainly invite your engagement on any of our projects or events. We've got events coming up in particular around those rules that I just mentioned on SEC disclosure. We're looking forward to new rules coming down on the control of methane, which is of the utmost importance. That's one folks need to weigh into. Obviously, we're supporting rules that would reduce emissions in medium and heavy duty trucks. That's another, again, directionally where we need to go. We're absolutely thrilled to have Secretary Granholm in office, to have Secretary Buttigieg in office, really thoughtful secretaries leading these agencies in a direction that represents the whole of government approach to climate change. We're thrilled to see that at the federal level. Also want to underscore there are great things happening in many of our states. And if you go to our website, you can see that we're active in 17 states. If you have a presence or a facility in one of those states and you'd like to become active, by all means, we would welcome your participation. Tremendous things happen at the state level. As Brandeis noted, the laboratories of experimentation from which we learn at the federal level. Thank you. We also have the registration for the webinar that's coming up on those SEC rules, and Gary Gensler himself is going to be our guest, so you can really dig in and understand the implications of these disclosure rules, which are historic in nature. One other, this is a great, we don't research climate change in Oz, we live it. I love it. Great, I love that last text. Let me just underscore one more thing you should keep your eyes on, and this goes to Mafalda's good question about what to do. In June, a critically important decision is going to come from our Supreme Court.
Hello.
And the decision is going to be whether or not the EPA can regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Is that you coming on, Mafalda? Do I hear you?
I hope so.
Yes. Enough from me. Let's hear from you.
No, please continue. I do have a little bit of a mic, but I can wait.
Just very quickly, just want to make sure you all know that West Virginia versus EPA, it's a really important case in the US that will determine whether or not the EPA can regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And it's kind of a case that was already settled. It really shouldn't be even brought, but unfortunately the court has agreed to take it up. We're quite worried that, given Justice Kavanaugh and some of his earlier opinions, we're quite worried that EPA's authority could be taken away. And if that happens, it'd be really unfortunate, not only for the EPA with regard to climate change, but it could affect EPA's authority to regulate under the Clean Water Act, under the Clean Air Act, to regulate hazardous substances. So it's of crucial importance. We very much want to win this case in the court of public opinion between now and June. You can Google it, West Virginia versus EPA, tweets, statements, blogs, forums. Let's make sure we preserve Environmental Protection Agency, which was established under Republican President Nixon. It needs to stay in place. It needs to have authority. Let's go ahead with your question, Mafalda.
I was just going to say about the SEC mandate, how helpful it is to have a mandate that shows people how important this is, how inescapable this is, because it's only then that will start to impact the everyday person that doesn't really pay attention to how climate change is not just at your doorstep, but it's already being felt. I know that in Australia, for example, the insurance companies refuse to insure certain houses that are on flooding areas or in high fire risk areas. So it's something that immediately makes you consider the impact of your choices. So it's a great tool.
You're absolutely right. You said that last sentence important. It makes you consider the impact of your choices. And in this case, the choices that may be affected is the allocation of millions of dollars of capital that could go into the right place or the wrong place. If you go toward a company that's really striving to reduce their emissions and support the clean energy economy, or it could go to a company that's really stuck in the last century and that is investing in the continuation of fossil fuel infrastructure, which will eventually be a stranded asset. It could go to a company that's going to set us backwards. It could go to companies who may not fully embrace the change that we need to see. So I couldn't agree more with you.
Yeah, I think that, again, it's only by changing the policy and by changing the status quo that it will have a bigger impact worldwide, not just of other countries' policies, but people's perception of how grave this problem is and how on our doorstep it is. Because it's not just our generation feeling it. And now I have several friends that have climate anxiety and are wondering if they're going to have kids. All of these things that have a massive impact on my generation and the ones to come have to be addressed today. They should have been addressed yesterday. But I'm glad that companies or that organizations like Ceres are around to make sure that those steps are being taken, and it's bringing to their doorsteps, to the politicians, to the investors, to the big companies, to the sectors that are the problem, and really put a mirror and say, this is not good enough.
Exactly. It is holding up that mirror and saying this is completely unacceptable, and this is going to set us backwards. And you're right. We absolutely have to do this on behalf of future generations. It should have been done way back in 1988 when Jim Hansen first brought this reality to Congress. There are many, many demarcation points we could look at that said we had the chance, we were so close. And this is another one of those moments. We are on the precipice of change as we speak. And in the US Congress, the next 2 months are going to be critical. That's why, in response to your question, I said, call your member of Congress and just say, do something about climate change, pass the climate investments, pass that reconciliation bill. I care. I want you to do something. I will say that I actually think young people have more of an influence at this point. And it's absolutely crucial. Participatory democracies work when people participate.
Exactly.
People need to be weighing in.
Well, in your website, you're quite transparent with your annual reports and your financials. I would like you to give us an idea of what would Ceres use the 100K for if you won.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind speaking to that. I mean, to emphasize again, we're a nonprofit organization, and our funding is largely coming from philanthropic resources and from funders who often put restrictions on the money that they are offering. So if we have a brand new idea or an innovative approach, because we're trying to pivot rapidly all the time, we often can't pay for it because we've been locked into certain grants that are going to work for certain reports, certain campaigns, investor pressure, and that's all well and good. But with this money, I think we would be able to quickly mobilize in a kind of an urgent way to work on what is extremely time sensitive. And what's extremely time sensitive now is getting this bill through Congress and also getting crucial campaigns in the states. So the states obviously have to support what the federal government does. They need to make sure that the money that comes from that bipartisan infrastructure package is spent properly, again, in a way that portends the future and that doesn't have us stuck in the past. So we would be able to use the money on quickly cranking out new campaigns, new communication campaigns, spreading the word more broadly. When I'm talking to you now, but obviously we need to be on multiple media channels on a regular basis. We need to be on our Sunday morning talk shows. We need to be in all of the major media outlets with this message. And to do that kind of scaled campaign costs money. It costs money. It requires staffing. And I can't emphasize enough the shortness of this window, because in November, we have the midterm elections in the US when there could easily be a change from one party to another. And historically, we have not seen tremendous leadership on the part of one particular party. And if they are successful in the fall, our chances are gone. And they will be gone for probably many years. So there's an immediate need to quickly scale up, have a success, get this bill through, get the investment that we need, which has already been proven to be cost effective, to really give the kind of boost to the clean energy industry that is so desperately needed. That then translates into companies being able to buy more renewable energy. They can buy more renewable energy, they can bring their emissions down, and again, we can move forward and move off of the fossil fuel economy that we're currently in. We also have to work toward things like reducing fossil fuel subsidies that just don't make any sense. We also, as the U.S., need to be responsible to other nations. So some of what we lobby for, some of what we push for, is also the Green Climate Fund, the kind of funding that helps other countries who had nothing to do with causing climate change but are suffering at the greatest levels. That's one of the things we've had companies lobby about. And we need to make sure that the Biden administration is keeping its promises in that regard. We also want to prepare ourselves slightly down the road, but in November, of course, we'll be back at the COP, and that'll be COP27, the Conference of the Parties, which is the global climate change meeting. And we want to be organized and powerful and compelling and have a real presence there so that we can move the needle and have a more successful meeting than we had in COP26. So we were pleased with some of the successes there. Again, all of this just has to move faster.
Exactly.
It's just, we just have a very, very high sense of urgency. I think that's what I would want to leave you with. And that's where we would put most of the money, is in moving quickly, scaling our campaigns in a bigger way, doing much of what we're doing, but doing it in a bigger and better and more scaled way.
I think it's also important to see the examples of other countries and how they have moved forward in this area. You have Germany, for example, that retrained all of their people that were working in gas and oil to become proficient at solar energy and installing sustainable energy resources. So it's also about being able to collectively move forward and not leave anyone behind. I think that a lot of the fear that some people have is that they're going to be left behind in this new wave of energy and sustainability and forward thinking, when in fact, I think that the goal is to get us all there. So I think it's important for not just the US, but all the other countries around the world to learn from each other.
You're absolutely right. And that kind of worker transition you're talking about is crucial. And this administration is committed to that very worker transition. There's something called the Civilian Climate Corps that's been on the books to mobilize people who are looking for jobs and immediately make them part of the solution. We can take people who were formerly in the fossil fuel sector and give them training so that they can work in the clean energy sector. Now, we have to make sure that the new jobs are well paying and that they're secure and that they're solid jobs and careers. Absolutely. And we can do that. Again, that's one of those things that we know how to do. We know how to train folks. We know how to make that transition happen. And you're also right that we have to learn from what other countries have done. I mean, the US doesn't have all the answers by a long shot. There's many, we look very closely at the EU goals and at the EU as an example. We have to look carefully, look at what's worked elsewhere, learn. We need to be humble about what we can and cannot do, and really encourage a high level of cooperation. That's why it is somewhat helpful working with global investors and global companies, because I think it allows for that kind of learning from one country to the next. And I would say that through our colleagues at We Mean Business, which is kind of a global coalition, we are always learning about what's going on in the rest of the world.
There's a question here. It's just asking if you guys have a lot of backlash.
We do get backlash. We certainly do. We can't be afraid of backlash. We have been criticized from day one for any number of reasons. In the early years, I think environmentalists generally take a lot of abuse in the early years of being, unrealistic or being hyperbolic or claiming that the sky was going to fall. That just goes with the territory. I'd say some of the backlash now is more that there are institutions and companies, and there are folks on the other side who feel we should slow this down, who really don't agree with the need to move as quickly as we need to move. Thankfully, we don't run into as many climate deniers as we used to. I used to run into them on Capitol Hill all the time. That has not happened lately, but there is a sense of let's slow down, that climate change isn't as urgent, that we have other things we have to take care of first, and that, one of the arguments that we're hearing a lot of currently is that energy independence is so crucial and that we should use the fossil fuel resources that the US has. That's often spun out as a patriotic move. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's simply not the case. So that's some of the backlash. I would say, though, as I think about it, I've been at Ceres for 16 years, and I would say that over the last 5 years, what strikes me more than the backlash is the consensus. It's the opposite, actually. And if you look at the Yale Center for Climate Communication, they do all this polling on public opinion, and everything is moving in the right direction. More people are on board. More citizens are realizing this is serious. This is a crisis. We have to act. And that's true for financial institutions as well and financial leaders. So in several parameters. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a tremendous amount to do and that there aren't cross currents and that there aren't, locked in damages that we're going to suffer. But in most areas, I could name several metrics that would demonstrate that we are making progress. The issue is, are we making progress fast enough? And that's the concern.
Exactly. We still have to keep, the rising of the temperatures below the 2 degrees centigrade, and it's just not looking that way. Not until there is like a severe cut with the status quo. And I mean, the more I look at it, unfortunately, the situation with Ukraine, as you mentioned before, it might have been a catalyst to some change happening, an awful catalyst, but it might be the push that our politicians needed, that they can't run away from, to start thinking about alternatives so they're not dependent on other countries and they're not dependent on oil and gas and other things that are not sustainable, not just ecologically but financially and geopolitically.
Yes. But again, though, the answer there is, we can break that dependence, and we can quickly, in a wartime kind of setting, you've probably read about Bill McKibben calling for heat pumps for peace. We could quickly mobilize. What we should be doing is, leveraging this moment. I don't want to say take advantage, because obviously this is a tragedy, but we can be practical and get ourselves off fossil fuels, but quickly develop the clean energy sector, mobilize, scale up the production of heat pumps and renewable energy so that we can put in renewable energy infrastructure and not fossil fuel infrastructure, and not just fall back on what has been the same old, and the industries that have control, have so much power, and unfortunately, far too much power in every sense of the word. We just need to shift that paradigm entirely. And you're right, we cannot stick with the status quo. That's where the discomfort comes in. That's where the agitation comes in. And that's what is needed day in and day out. And that's what folks should tell their lawmakers. You're ready for a change. We're ready to see this happen, and you're going to vote for it. People are distracted, understandably, by rising food prices and gas prices right at this moment. But none of that should change the fact that front and center, we just have to address climate change first and foremost.
Very much true.
And yes, to the person in the chat, there should be fines for wasting energy. I completely agree with that. I'm a former criminal enforcer. I used to do environmental crime, drop a dime on environmental crime. That was our catchphrase. So it was all about fines and all about penalizing folks. So I know that world, and I think it makes a lot of sense. We need more than that. We should absolutely incentivize. What we really want to do, and one of the reasons I came to Ceres is because it seemed to me there were peaceful ways to solve problems and to meet one's opposition and really hammer out solutions. How do we incentivize the use of renewable energy and incentivize the use of EVs? And there's lots of programs now that do that. It's really interesting to look at the electric vehicle equation, and we should really examine the uptake of that in the coming years, because so many incentives have been put into place and the prices have come down so far.
I'm actually curious if you know how the educational system has changed its approach to climate change. Because I remember that the whole ozone layer and recycling became a huge deal in terms of being taught at school, and that created a generational change. Has that been kept up with with climate change in general?
I am not an educational specialist, but I have been in the field, in the environmental field, a very long time. And I can remember back in the 90s when environmental education, started to be taught in the schools on a more regular basis. By the way, this varies tremendously from state to state. So I certainly couldn't the broad brush. And I am aware that in many of the Scandinavian countries, they just do a much, much better job of this. We said at the time that there was a dangerous notion at the time that not to worry, the next generation is going to take care of this. We're going to teach them about recycling. We're going to teach them about saving water. I don't think we had all fully embraced the seriousness of climate change in the 90s. I think that was a risk. And so, yes, there were programs. I remember there being environmental bowls, competitions with students to try to get the answers right. Have we really embedded climate change education into our educational system in the way that we need to? I'd have to say no. And again, I think there are certain schools that are doing this better than others. Certain jurisdictions are probably doing this better. But I would say it's something that we probably need to do a much better job of, so that in particular people can understand climate science much, much better than they do. Because you are putting your finger on something that the lack of understanding is really getting in the way of action. And people are often not comfortable asking the questions that need to be asked so that they can understand it. And there's often confusion about climate change. You mentioned the ozone layer. There's often confusion there. People often understand. I mentioned plastics just because people understand that we may be headed to a time where there'll be more plastics than fish in the ocean. This is crucially important. I used to be in solid waste and recycling at the beginning of my career, and people really understood solid waste. They understood trash. It's a little bit harder to really understand the implications, the causes, and the remedies around climate change, but we absolutely need that education.
Is there any educational resource that you would recommend for people that want to learn more about it?
Where to begin? There's so much out there. I wouldn't want to, I'm a big fan of Bill McKibben's writings. He's written several books on the topic. Most of you on this call have probably, somebody just put in one of my favorite all-time quotes from Chief Seattle. Thank you. I think probably most people on this call have seen An Inconvenient Truth, and which it's hard to believe that was way back in 2006. which was Al Gore's film. If you go to the Climate Reality Project, there's all kinds of educational resources there, including you can have speakers come to your organization and speak about it. But there's just so much more now than there's ever been before. It's easy to Google and to get background and to get educated, which is the good news. It's not obscure. It's all out there.
Yeah, exactly. We now all have supercomputers in our back pockets, so we have access to all the information. Sometimes it's about sifting through the garbage that people find online to get to the good resources.
Well, that's true too. So one wants to be careful about which authors, yeah, for sure, about to whom, whose work they're looking at. But there's a tremendous amount. There's a tremendous amount on public television as well. There's just any number of resources, and of course the Ceres website. And my colleague just put up our site. We've got quite a lot of resources there, as does WRI, the World Resources Institute, the World Wildlife Fund. With many allies. I could mention that the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. Again, these are U.S.-based organizations that have a global footprint and a global reach. Oxfam has done a lot of good work in the food space, but I'm sure I'm leaving others out. There is so many resources available if folks want to become more educated.
Well, I will just ask for the people that are listening to us, if you have any question, to ask it now, because we are about to wrap it up. And let me see. Oh, also, if you missed any of this conversation, we are keeping a record of all AMAs on the Space Poggers YouTube account, so you can head there to listen to the whole thing. You can also learn more about Ceres. I would recommend you to go to the Ceres website, ceres.org, and check out their website. There's so much more that you can find about their initiatives, the focus sectors, partnerships, roadmap. As I said before, you have also access to their annual reports and financials. And there's lots of short videos there too, which I found really interesting. Is there anything else, Anne, that you would like to say, sort of to encompass this conversation?
I would just first off say thank you to all of you and to you, Mafalda. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I guess I would just emphasize that the topic we're talking about is urgent. We absolutely need to act, but there really is hope embedded in everything that I'm saying. This is a problem we can collectively solve. And I have no doubt that this is something I keep hope alive. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to be able to do this collectively and to really build a better world for future generations.
Well, you keep me hopeful. Sometimes it's a little bit hard, but people like you do keep me hopeful and trusting that humanity will get their act together.
We must. We absolutely must. Those who've gone before us have done harder things, and we absolutely must. I would take inspiration. I'm just going to say, if we think our day is hard and we get frustrated, I will say that I've taken a lot of inspiration from those Ukrainian families, and I don't have to tell you what I mean by that. If they can pick up guns every day to defend their community, I think we can pick up the conversation on climate change and get it done.
Yeah, we have it a lot easier.
We sure do.
All right, Anne, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you to everyone in your team that has helped make this come true. Also to Jim from our side, who has been amazing onboarding and with the emails. I just wanted to thank everyone involved. As I said, if you'd like to know more about Ceres, please head to their website, and I'll see you guys very soon.
Great. Thank you, Mafalda. Bye-bye. Thanks so much.